A murderer is on the run in Britain tonight. In fact, two violent offenders walked out of an open prison on New Year's Day and just vanished.
Tonight, the streets boiled over. What began as a single gathering in the heart of the capital, people arriving angry, cold, and ready to be heard, turned in hours into a nationwide confrontation that tested the limits of policing, politics, and public patience. The direct trigger was simple and immediate: a government statement confirming an accelerated early release program to relieve chronic prison overcrowding. That announcement, intended as a technical measure to prevent systemic collapse, landed in working-class towns and city centers like a provocation. For too many, it read as an official decision to prioritize institutional convenience over everyday safety. Within 2 hours, that perception had metastasized into action. Crowds assembled not as one organized block, but as a swelling current of disparate people: commuters, shopkeepers, parents, veterans, neighbors who had never marched before, all united by the single demand that their streets be made safe again. The mood was not abstract, it was immediate and personal. Voices rose, signs were improvised, and anger sharpened into a raw, kinetic force. The first official line of riot police arrived in a tense, visible attempt to contain the square, but containment quickly became contact. Bottles and lighters arced toward the police, not as a planned volley, but as spontaneous acts of defiance. The officers formed a shielded line and attempted controlled advances. On the other side, crowds braced like a flood against a dam. When the barriers buckled and a surge pushed through a side lane, the clash intensified. Batons cracked in measured blows, shields slammed into bodies, kettling maneuvers closed exits, and pushed people into tighter space. People were pushed, shoved, and stampeded. Some fell, were trampled, and were helped to their feet by strangers. Arrests were made in quick succession, each one sparking louder cries and a renewed surge. It was the kind of close, brutal engagement that leaves vivid scars and urgent questions without ever becoming a scripted battle. Neither side escalated to lethal force. Instead, the violence was up close and grinding baton impacts, the sting of pepper and irritant spray, the shock of being pressed between a wall and a shield, the desperate scramble for breathing air as smoke flares, and the acrid tang of tear gas cut through the square. Beyond the capital, the pattern repeated with local variations. In several regional centers, municipal offices and hotel sites used for temporary accommodation were surrounded by angry crowds, demanding to know who was being housed nearby and on what terms. In one northern town, a small group smashed the glass frontage of a travel agent before police lines pushed them back. In another city, a demonstration that began as a peaceful march degenerated when a contingent tried to force entry to a council building where a meeting was taking place. Police responded with baton charges to clear choke points, kettled groups on high streets to prevent further movement, and made targeted arrests. Protesters erected makeshift barricades of shopping trolleys and timber planks in side streets. Police removed them with coordinated teams, often amid throwing of stones and repeated shouts that the state had abandoned them. These were not cinematic battles. They were intimate, ugly confrontations between exhausted public servants and citizens who felt they had been ignored for years. The narrative on the airwaves and across social platforms raced ahead of the facts, amplifying every clip, every confrontation, every allegation. Smartphone cameras recorded the most charged moments: an officer taking a heavy blow to a shield, a protester hauled away and cuffed, the shock of a window shattering into 1,000 reflective fragments. Short videos looped with breathless captions, and within minutes, the footage had traveled far beyond the cities where the events were actually unfolding. Commentators and influencers on different sides fed each other's worst fears. Administrators warned of the dangers of misinformation, while community leaders and opposition voices warned that the government's policies had created the tinder for this conflagration. Press conferences, when they came, offered a mix of stern warnings about criminality and appeals for calm. But many in the crowd heard the institutional language as another layer of distance, another form of insulation that protected policymakers from the immediate human consequences of their choices. At ground level, the clashes followed a pattern of escalation and adaptation. When police tightened lines in a market square, protesters split into smaller groups and reappeared in adjacent streets. When officers used mounted units or dogs to slow advances, crowds countered with sudden dispersals and regrouping, only to return to choke points when reinforcements were diverted. Officers reported stretched resources and rapidly shifting priorities. 1 minute focused on protecting civic infrastructure, the next on clearing a path for ambulances or securing a perimeter around a hotel. Commanders described choosing between the lesser evils, risking injuries in a preemptive charge, or accepting property damage while they prioritized saving lives. The public saw the choices as indecision or cowardice. Officers described them as professional judgment calls made under intense pressure and with incomplete information. Several towns reported targeted incidents at accommodation sites used for people seeking shelter or awaiting immigration decisions. In some places, volunteers and staff inside those facilities reported being threatened and shouted at. In others, staff locked doors and refused entry to angry groups seeking immediate confrontations. There were scenes of flames in wheelie bins and small localized fires set to rubbish outside some hotel, entrances dangerous and incendiary gestures that threatened to escalate beyond control. Fire crews arrived under police escort to put out blazes, and local medical services reported dozens of minor injuries, cuts, bruises, smoke inhalation, alongside a smaller number of more serious incidents requiring hospital treatment. The images of flames and boarded windows traveled fast, bringing more people out who felt compelled to join what they called a defense of their communities. Political leaders scrambled into damage limitation mode. The Prime Minister's office issued a statement urging calm, promising rapid reviews of the measures that had precipitated the unrest and vowing to increase visible street patrols. Opposition figures seized the opportunity to link the unrest to broader policy failures, warning that short-term fixes to overcrowding should not come at the expense of public safety. Some town councilors and local MPs walked into crowds to try to converse and de-escalate. Others were shouted down and forced to retreat. A handful of mayors called for immediate national task forces to coordinate housing, policing, and social services actions that, while practical, arrived after the anger had already found its own momentum. What made the nights different from ordinary demonstrations was how rapidly civic life around them started to fray. High streets that once thrummed with trade went quiet as traders shuttered and small businesses began to board up windows amid fears of looting or collateral damage. Bus companies rerouted services, schools updated parents about closures and late pickups, and hospitals issued safety advisories for staff. For many residents, the rhythm of life was suspended. Children fetched early from after-school clubs, evening shifts left work early, and older people were told to stay indoors until the immediate danger had passed. Insurance companies started to assess claims even as the unrest continued, and some lenders and investors began to flag the potential long-term economic costs of sustained civil disturbance, lower footfall, damaged commercial property, and the prospect of lost livelihoods for small business owners who could least afford it. On the streets, the clashes took on a ritualized tone. Officers, trained in crowd control disciplines, moved in disciplined columns, pushing, withdrawing, reforming, and advancing again. Protesters adapted, using sudden, coordinated surges to break momentum, and pulling back when faced with tight formation. There were moments of raw human drama, strangers forming human chains to prop up those who had fallen, a retired nurse administering first aid, young volunteers handing out water to coughing, tear-streaked faces. There were also raw, ugly disputes. People pushed down and kicked as groups sought to clear a passage, a shopkeeper shouting as drunks tried to smash a display, a police officer unmasked and struck in the face before being restrained by colleagues. In many ways, the exchanges were a tragic choreography of modern civil unrest. Up close, chaotic, fundamentally human, and deeply corrosive to trust. Behind the scenes, emergency services and local authorities tried to manage not just the immediate confrontations, but the simmering social conditions that had fed them. Councils moved to accelerate housing placements for vulnerable older residents and veterans. Charities scrambled to open donation centers for those who suddenly found themselves cut off or hurt. Community leaders convened neighborhood meetings to try to rebuild lines of communication. But these moves, however vital, felt reactive in the face of what many described as a long-term pattern of neglect. under-resourced local services, rising costs of living, and a simmering sense among many that their needs were not a priority for the centers of power. The aftermath will be messy and contested. Local inquiries will scrutinize the decision-making that preceded the unrest. Police reviews will examine tactics and the use of force. Politicians will trade blame across press conferences and primetime interviews. There will be calls for tougher crackdowns and, just as loudly, for systemic reforms that reduce pressures on the criminal justice system without offloading risk onto vulnerable communities. For those who lived through the clashes, the questions are immediate and personal. How do we restore the sense of safety that was lost in a few hours? How do we repair the trust between communities and the institutions meant to protect them? And who will properly account for the livelihoods and the damaged small businesses that paid a price for that night's violence? What is clear in the rubble and the footage is that the crisis did not emerge from nowhere. Years of policy trade-offs between rehabilitation and public protection, between short-term capacity fixes and long-term investment in probation and social services created a pressure cooker. That does not excuse individuals who committed crimes during the unrest, nor does it justify attacks on innocent staff or volunteers who found themselves trapped in the crossfire. But it does explain why a policy that may have seemed like an administrative necessity at Whitehall felt for so many like a final provocation. The challenge now is to translate that understanding into action that reduces risk, restores dignity to victims, and rebuilds civic infrastructure so that the next crisis does not begin in the same place. Until then, the images of that night, shields and shutters, smoke and shouting, people helping each other amid the crush will remain a stark reminder of how quickly the social contract can fray when institutions and citizens lose a shared sense of safety and fairness.